A man is sitting in a police interview room in Glasgow. It's May 2005, a few weeks after a young woman's body was pulled out of a forest in South Lanarkshire. He tells the officers something specific. He's taken women to that forest before. He knows the road in. He can describe the turning. The obvious question is whether this man becomes a suspect. He doesn't. He's released, and for the next 17 years, nobody arrests him for this murder. That single fact carries this entire story. The question worth asking isn't who killed Emma Caldwell. That gets answered in full by the end. The question is how a police force can hold a man capable of describing a body's location before it was public knowledge, let him go, and then do it 5 more times across 2 years before deciding he wasn't worth pursuing at all. To understand how that was possible, we have to go back further than the murder itself, because the answer to who Emma Caldwell was changes how every decision that follows should be read. It also requires understanding the world she was moving through in the last years of her life, because that world shaped both how she came to be vulnerable and how the institutions meant to protect her chose to see her. She was born in January 1978, near Cardross on Scotland's west coast, into a family her relatives describe as close and affectionate. She grew up around horses and by her early 20s was working as a riding instructor, patient, good with animals, settled. Nothing about that early life predicts what comes later, and that gap matters. In 1998, Emma's older sister died of cancer. The grief hit hard. A partner, trying to help her cope, introduced her to heroin. It didn't help. By 2002, she was living in Govan, in Glasgow, addicted, and funding that addiction through street sex work. That's the point where her story stops being only hers, because Emma wasn't working alone. Glasgow, in the early 2000s, had a pattern already forming women in street sex work going missing, some found dead, some never found at all. Strathclyde police were already under pressure over it, from families, from campaigners, from the press. Emma's own family have described how close they remained to her throughout this period, despite everything. She saw both her parents twice a week and spoke to them by phone most days. Days before she vanished, she'd told her mother she was hoping to leave heroin behind for good. That detail complicates any easy account of who Emma Caldwell was in the last months of her life. She wasn't a woman adrift from her family. She was a woman still held by one, still trying to build something different, still calling her mother. When Emma disappeared on the 4th of April 2005, last seen on CCTV walking alone near midnight, heading toward Victoria Road, her family did something that some of those other families hadn't been able to do. They pushed. They made sure she had a public face. It's worth holding on to that contrast, because it recurs through this entire case, a system capable of treating some victims as more visible than others, while still failing all of them in the same fundamental way. The women who tried to warn police about the man who killed her were, for the most part, granted no such visibility at all. The area of Glasgow where Emma worked in the final years of her life had, by the early 2000s, developed a reputation that went beyond ordinary concern for the safety of women in street sex work. Several women involved in that trade had gone missing over the preceding years, and more than one had turned up dead. Campaigners and support workers had spent years raising alarms about the vulnerability of women working those streets, warning that whoever was responsible for the pattern was still out there, still operating. It's against that backdrop that Emma's disappearance has to be understood, not as an isolated tragedy, but as one more entry in a set of cases the city and its police force already knew they were failing to solve. Her body was found a month later, on the 8th of May, in Limefield Woods near Roberton, South Lanarkshire. Remote, specific, not a place anyone stumbles into. Whoever left her there knew that ground, and within weeks police had a man in an interview room who was telling them exactly that. Strathclyde police opened a murder inquiry that would become one of the most expensive in the force's history, and they started, sensibly enough, with the men in Emma's life. One name surfaced early: Ian Packer. Between 2005 and 2007, he was interviewed 6 times. Here's what actually happened in those rooms. Packer told officers he'd taken women to woodland in South Lanarkshire before. He was able to direct them to the specific location where Emma's body had been found. According to Davy Barr, one of the detectives present, this was enough that he expected Packer to be escalated to a formal suspect. He phoned his superior officer to say so. The answer that came back, as Barr later described it, was blunt. Packer wasn't going to be made an accused. At the same time, Packer was lying about how well he'd known Emma. He first told police he'd only encountered her 3 or 4 times. Later, under further questioning, he admitted the true number was closer to 15. A man minimizing his connection to a murder victim by a factor of 4 or 5, while simultaneously walking detectives through the geography of where her body would be found, is not a marginal figure in an investigation. He's close to its center, and yet he left every one of those 6 interviews as a witness, not a suspect. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it isn't a story about evidence that didn't exist. 6 separate interviews over roughly 2 years is not a brief encounter that slipped through the cracks of a busy inquiry. It's a sustained relationship between an investigation and a man it kept bringing back in, kept listening to, and kept releasing. Somewhere in that repetition, a decision was made not necessarily by any single officer, and not necessarily in a single moment, but a decision nonetheless that Packer's account, however contradictory, was less worth pursuing than the theory the force had already begun to build elsewhere. Davy Barr's account of that period is one of the clearest windows available into how the decision was actually made on the ground. He has described sitting in the room with Packer, hearing him describe taking women to that same stretch of woodland, and understanding immediately that this was significant. His instinct, as an officer directly engaged with the evidence in front of him, was that Packer needed to be escalated. It was only when he raised that with someone above him in the chain of command that the direction of the investigation was overridden. That detail matters because it tells us the failure here wasn't simply a lack of competence or attentiveness among the officers doing the interviewing. Somewhere between the interview room and the decisions being made about where to direct resources, a different judgment was applied, one that, in hindsight, protected the wrong man. So why wasn't he pursued? To answer that, you have to look at what Strathclyde police were doing instead, because they weren't standing still. They were spending millions of pounds on an entirely different theory. Detectives became convinced Emma's murder was connected to a group of men of Turkish origin running a takeaway business, allegedly linked to trafficking women for sex work. Surveillance was mounted, resources poured in, 4 men were arrested and in July 2007 appeared in court charged in connection with her murder. For a moment, this looks like resolution. It wasn't. Specialists reviewing the surveillance recordings tapes the case had been built on found no evidence the men had ever discussed killing Caldwell. The prosecution collapsed. One of the 4 later sued the newly formed Police Scotland for wrongful arrest, having spent 80 days on remand and settled out of court for £100,000 in damages. The operation is estimated to have cost around £4 million. To put that figure into some kind of proportion, it's worth remembering what that money bought. Extended surveillance teams, translators, months of covert monitoring, and eventually a prosecution that fell apart the moment independent specialists actually listened closely to what had been recorded. 4 men who had nothing to do with Emma Caldwell's death spent months living under suspicion of murder, one of them 80 days in a cell, before the theory that had consumed years of Strathclyde Police's resources simply evaporated under scrutiny. There's a human cost to that collapsed prosecution that's easy to lose in the language of wasted budgets. 4 men who had nothing to do with Emma Caldwell's death were publicly named in connection with her murder, arrested, and in one case held on remand for nearly 3 months before the case against them fell apart. Their lives and the lives of their families were reshaped by an accusation that turned out to have no foundation at all. That one of them went on to sue Police Scotland and win damages doesn't undo the months spent under suspicion of a crime he didn't commit. It simply confirms formally what should have been obvious far sooner. This is where the case widens into something larger than a missed suspect. It becomes a story about an institution that had already spent everything: money, manpower, credibility, pursuing 4 innocent men, while the man who actually did it had already told them, on tape, where to find the clearing his victim was left in. One detective working the case at the time called the Turkish men operation a colossal waste of money and said he believed senior officers wanted a conviction specifically because of how much had already been sunk into it. Another suggested that the scale of that operation blinded the force to more realistic suspects sitting in plain view. Which raises the harder question underneath all of it. Once an institution has committed that heavily to a theory, can it still see evidence that contradicts it? Or does the cost of being wrong start to function as its own kind of evidence suppression? There's a particular kind of institutional psychology at work here, one that recurs across failed investigations far beyond this one. It isn't that individual officers set out to protect a killer, it's that large and expensive operations generate their own momentum. Careers become attached to their outcome. Reputations, budgets, and public statements already made to the press all create pressure to be right, and that pressure doesn't disappear just because new evidence starts pointing somewhere else. Ian Packer didn't need to be clever. He needed an investigation that had already spent its credibility elsewhere, and by 2007, that's precisely what he had. What makes this more troubling still is what the eventual case against Packer would go on to reveal about the shape of his behavior. This wasn't a single act of violence that came out of nowhere. The pattern the 2022 charges described stretched back more than 2 decades and forward well beyond Emma's death encounters that repeatedly involved control, aggression, and, according to multiple women, attempts to choke or strangle them during sex. 16 separate women would eventually describe violent behavior at his hands. A further 11 described him grabbing or trying to strangle them specifically. That is not the profile of a man capable of concealing himself indefinitely. It's the profile of a man whose pattern was visible to a great many people for a great many years, well before any single police force chose to look at it as a whole. While all of this played out, Ian Packer didn't disappear. He stayed in Glasgow, and multiple women sex workers he continued to use began telling police about a man who was violent, who choked them, who took them to woodland outside the city. Different women, the same man, the same pattern that was already sitting in the 2005 file. According to lawyers representing the Caldwell family, these women weren't treated as witnesses pointing toward a killer police had already interviewed 6 times. In several cases, they say, the women were dismissed, sometimes arrested themselves. This is where the case stops being about one bad call in 2005 and becomes about a sustained pattern, sitting undisturbed for a decade, of women naming the same man to a system that had already met him. Each of these encounters, taken alone, might be dismissed as an isolated failure of process, a complaint not properly logged, a report not passed up the chain. Taken together, across years and multiple women, they describe something closer to a structural blind spot, a willingness to hear allegations against Packer without ever connecting them back to the file that already carried his name in relation to a murder investigation. The women making those reports had no way of knowing that connection existed. The institution receiving them did. Some of the women who crossed paths with Packer in those years did not live to see any resolution. One woman, who knew Emma personally and had gone into hiding from Packer around the time Emma disappeared, died in 2021 at the age of 43. Her mother has since said she believes her daughter carried survivor's guilt for years for not having been able to help Emma when she needed it most. That guilt, if it is what it seems to be, was carried for over 15 years inside a case the system had already quietly set aside. Emma's father, William Caldwell, died in 2011, 6 years after his daughter's murder, with no one convicted. Before he died, he asked his wife Margaret to keep fighting. She did for 13 more years, so who finally breaks this open? Not the police. In April 2015, the Sunday Mail published an article naming Ian Packer publicly a man questioned within weeks of Emma's body being found a decade earlier. A single piece of journalism did what 6 internal interviews and years of institutional knowledge hadn't. It forced a response. Under instruction from the Lord Advocate, Police Scotland launched a formal re-investigation later that year. Sit with that sequence for a moment. The file hadn't changed. The name hadn't changed. What changed was that the pressure to act on both finally came from outside the institution that was supposed to have acted on them years earlier. There's something uncomfortable in that dependence on the press to do what a police force with vastly greater resources and legal authority had already failed to do for a decade. Journalism can apply pressure. It can put a name in front of the public in a way that makes silence more costly than action. But it shouldn't be the mechanism by which a police force is finally made to look at its own file. That it was in this case says something about how thoroughly the original theory of the crime had calcified inside Strathclyde Police by 2015, and how little internal appetite there was to revisit it without an external push. The reinvestigation that followed was enormous by any measure. Over 7 years, more than 30,000 documents and statements were gathered and reviewed. In excess of 23,000 individual productions, physical evidence, photographs, samples were re-examined. New forensic techniques unavailable in 2005 were applied to material that had simply been sitting in storage for over a decade. New witnesses came forward, several of them women assaulted by Packer in the years since Emma's death, now willing to speak in a way the original inquiry had never made room for. It is worth pausing on the scale of that effort because it answers a question that might otherwise hang over this whole account. Was the file simply too thin in 2005 to act on? The reinvestigation says no. A properly resourced, properly motivated inquiry, working from largely the same starting material, was able to build an overwhelming case. What had changed wasn't the underlying evidence so much as the willingness to look at it seriously and the political and public pressure that made looking away no longer an option. Among that forensic work was a test that would ultimately decide the case. In 2021, 16 years after Emma's body was found, a soil sample was taken from the site in Limefield Woods and compared against soil recovered from the work Van Packer had used at the time of her death. The match was 97%. That test could have been run at any point once Packer became a person of interest. It wasn't, because he was never formally treated as one. 16 years is the size of that gap. A 97% soil match is not a piece of evidence that required new science to exist. Comparative soil analysis of this kind was available, in less refined form, well before 2005. What it required was a reason to test Packer's van against that specific stretch of woodland, and no one had that reason until a newspaper, a decade later, forced the question back onto the table. The evidence that would ultimately convict him had, in that sense, been waiting the entire time, not undiscovered, simply unlooked for. On the 25th of February 2022, 17 years after the murder, Ian Packer was finally arrested. And the case widened again, sharply. He wasn't facing one charge, he faced 45 in total, involving 27 other women, 3 men and 1 boy, 11 of the charges alleging rape, spanning more than 2 decades. According to family lawyers, Packer committed an estimated 19 further sexual offenses or assaults after Emma's murder offenses that happened in the years he had already been interviewed, already been named by multiple women, and had already led police directly to the location of a body. Reading that charge sheet is, in some ways, the clearest possible statement of what this case is actually about. It isn't simply that one investigation reached the wrong conclusion in 2005, it's that the wrong conclusion was allowed to stand for so long that an entire second decade of victims accumulated behind it, men, women, and at least 1 child harmed by a person who should, on the strength of what police already knew in 2005, never have had the opportunity to harm them at all. The trial opened at the High Court in Glasgow in January 2024. Packer denied murdering Emma outright. "It wasn't me who killed her," he told the court. "I didn't do anything to her." But under further questioning, the account he'd maintained since 2005 came apart in specific ways. He admitted he'd continued having sex with Emma after she asked him to stop. He admitted that when he'd previously denied in a televised documentary ever raping her, he hadn't been honest. He said he'd felt set up by the journalist questioning him and had been ashamed of his own behavior. He admitted he'd lied to police in 2005 when he claimed barely to know her at all. The prosecution built its case from 17 separate circumstances, arguing that the location of the body was the most telling of all. No one else connected to the investigation had ever shown any inclination to take women to that particular stretch of woodland. 16 sex workers testified to violent behavior by Packer. A further 11 described him grabbing or attempting to strangle them. Prosecutor Richard Goddard, K.C., described him during the trial as a violent and obsessive user of sex workers, driven by what he called an unhealthy addiction to procuring their services, and argued the strangulation and murder of Emma Caldwell was the most severe chapter in a course of sexual violence against women lasting 2 decades. Woman after woman took the stand to describe encounters with Packer that followed a similar shape: control, aggression, and in many cases, direct threats to their lives. One woman later told reporters that giving evidence had been hard, but that she felt she owed it to Emma. Every word she said, she believed, could give Margaret Caldwell some measure of peace. It's a small remark, but it captures something central to how this case moved forward at all, not through the system correcting itself, but through women who had every reason to stay silent, choosing repeatedly to speak anyway. On the 28th of February 2024, the jury returned its verdict: guilty of Emma Caldwell's murder and 32 further charges involving 22 women. 3 charges were found not proven: life imprisonment with a minimum term of 36 years. At sentencing, Lord Becket told Packer he had pursued, over more than 25 years, a campaign of violence and appallingly selfish sexual mistreatment against a very large number of women. He said he had read statements from 8 surviving women, as well as from Emma's mother, brother, and his partner, each, he said, a raw and heart-rending account of enduring harm. Margaret Caldwell's statement described a life already reshaped once by the earlier death of her older daughter, and then permanently altered by Emma's murder grief she said she carried every day, alongside the knowledge that Emma had spoken before she died about wanting to leave her addiction behind and rebuild her life. One woman connected to a separate part of the indictment had died in 2021 at 43. Her mother told the court she believed her daughter's death was tied to survivor's guilt, having known Emma and gone into hiding from Packer around the time Emma disappeared, unable to help her. Another woman described a fortnight in which Packer repeatedly detained her in her own home, at one point holding a knife to her, during which she believed she was going to die. A third told the court that the trauma of testifying had reawakened depression she had spent years working to recover from, telling the judge she no longer felt like the person she had been before the trial began. Lord Becket described each of these accounts as raw, honest, and articulate, and said the trauma Packer had caused had endured in some cases for decades. For Margaret Caldwell, sitting through that testimony meant hearing in detail the same pattern of violence that had taken her daughter, described again and again by different women across different decades. She has said publicly that she found it difficult to comprehend how it had taken so long to reach this point, knowing, as she now did, that Packer had been interviewed by police within weeks of Emma's murder. Outside the court, lawyers representing Margaret Caldwell described a culture within the original investigation that they called toxic misogyny, they said, and corruption that meant instead of receiving justice and compassion, the women who tried to warn police about Packer were humiliated, dismissed, and in some cases arrested, while the man they were describing was left free to offend again. Assistant Chief Constable Bex Smith, on behalf of Police Scotland, apologised, stating plainly that Emma Caldwell, her family, and many other victims had been let down by policing in 2005, and that the women who came forward at the time had not received the justice or support they deserved from Strathclyde Police. That apology accounts for the failure, it doesn't explain it. And within days of the verdict, Margaret Caldwell met with Scotland's First Minister and asked directly for a public inquiry into how her daughter's case had been handled. One was announced the following day. The family wanted a judge from outside Scotland's own justice system to lead it, arguing that the scale of both the crimes and the institutional failures surrounding them was too severe for anything less to be credible. That request wasn't granted. In April 2025, Lord Scott, a serving Scottish judge, was appointed to chair the inquiry instead, a decision the family's solicitor warned could limit how far it was willing to look. And there are real reasons for that concern. The inquiry's remit named Strathclyde Police specifically. But the senior detectives responsible for the wrongful pursuit of the 4 Turkish men went on to hold senior positions within Police Scotland, the national force that absorbed Strathclyde in 2013 under a chief constable who had led both. Whether the inquiry reaches that far up the chain remains an open question. Lord Scott has said he was consulted on the terms of reference and is satisfied they allow a thorough investigation of the issues involved. Scotland's Justice Secretary has described the remit as robust and well-focused, while acknowledging it doesn't cover every concern the family raised. Both of those statements can be true, and the gap between them can still matter. There's one further thread that sits outside its scope entirely, and it's the most unsettling in the whole case. One of Packer's other victims, who knew Emma personally, has said publicly that she believes some of Emma's clients at the time were themselves police officers. This hasn't been tested through any formal process, and it should be treated with the caution any untested claim deserves. But its existence, alongside everything else uncovered here, explains why so many people close to this case remain unconvinced that the full picture has surfaced, and why Packer's other victims have, according to the family's solicitor, been excluded from the inquiry's terms of reference, despite his argument that they belong at its centre. So this returns finally to where it started. A man who was never hidden, sitting across a table from detectives within a month of a murder, describing in his own words the route to the place her body would be found. Justice, in the narrow legal sense, has been done. A jury heard the evidence, a judge passed sentence. Ian Packer will spend at least the next several decades in prison, and Margaret Caldwell, after 19 years, has a conviction her husband didn't live to see. But what the courtroom resolved and what this case resolved are not the same thing. The verdict answers who killed Emma Caldwell. It does not fully answer why the people responsible for finding that answer in 2005 chose, or were directed, to look elsewhere instead. And it doesn't tell us how many of the 22 other women recognized in Packer's convictions might have been spared what happened to them, had that file been read differently the first time it landed on someone's desk. The public inquiry now underway may in time offer more of that answer. It may not. What's already certain is that the file was never missing. It sat for 19 years inside an institution that had every opportunity to open it and chose again and again to look somewhere else. What society has taken from this case in the years since Packer's conviction is not a simple lesson about a single bad investigation. It's a harder one about what happens when an institution becomes more invested in defending a theory than in testing it, and about how many people can be harmed in the space that creates. 22 women recognized in Packer's convictions lived through some part of the years during which he should already have been in custody. Their suffering isn't a footnote to Emma Caldwell's story. It's the clearest possible measure of what 19 years of institutional hesitation actually cost. Margaret Caldwell has spent more of her life fighting for this case than most people spend building an entire career. Her husband did not live to see it end. She has said, in the aftermath of the verdict, that she wants the full truth not just about Packer, but about everyone who let him remain free. Whether the current inquiry can deliver that remains to be seen. For a case of this scale, accountability was never going to arrive in a single moment. The conviction closed one chapter. The public inquiry, still in its early stages, is meant to close another, examining what training, procedures and decisions inside Strathclyde Police allowed a man already interviewed 6 times to remain free for as long as he did. Whether it succeeds will depend on how far it's willing to look and how honestly the institutions being examined are willing to answer. The question this case leaves behind isn't whether the system eventually worked. Eventually, it did. The question is what it takes, how much money, how many victims, how many years, how much pressure from outside rather than from within for a file that was already complete to finally be read. And it's worth asking, watching this case close, how many other files like it are sitting somewhere right now, waiting for the same kind of pressure to force them open.